Plenty of developments to talk about on the federal political scene this week, including a former chief and now member of Parliament. Billy Morin has been appointed as the Conservatives' opposition critic for Indigenous Services. And the recently elected Liberal Party says it won't be presenting a new budget until the fall. Here to break it all down is our Truth in Politics panel. Jennifer Laewetz is the CEO of Paskwâw Strategies, and Niigaan Sinclair is a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. Jennifer, Niigaan, great to have the band back together this week. Jennifer, we'll start with you and your thoughts on MP Billy Morin being named as the opposition critic for Indigenous Services.
Well, first and foremost, congratulations to former Chief Billy Morin. He was newly elected and then thrown into shadow cabinet. But I think this kind of branches off of the conversation that's been happening over the last several weeks, where we're seeing a lot of Indigenous representation in the government now, MPs, now ministers of Mark Carney's government. I think this is exciting. I think it's going to be a great learning curve for him. I think Indigenous representation, no matter where it is at that table within the federal government, is a good thing. I think we just have to remember that as First Nations people, it's a little tricky because the federal government is there to administer the services, but that's the same system that's been, historically very oppressive to our people. And now we're seeing Indigenous people that are now servants of the Crown. So it's going to be interesting. I think we need to give patience and a little bit of understanding to our fellow Indigenous people that are entering into these federal positions. And I hope he does good in it.
Niigaan, it's not unheard of for the opposition critic for Indigenous Services to be Indigenous, but of course this is the first time an Indigenous woman or person, period, is leading the department. Your thoughts on this pick?
I think it's one of those interesting moments, and it's worth noting for its historical precedence, but it's also going to lead to some interesting conversations. As we know, the relationship between the Conservatives and the Liberals has been rancorous and very accusatory. And that's, if you were to go to any sort of Indigenous gathering, and when Indigenous peoples disagree, which is probably the best thing that we do, it is not most often rancorous. It's not a lot of pointing fingers. It's done with diplomacy. It's done with a kind of in and around conversation. Sometimes people will tell you a story instead of telling that you're outright wrong. I'd be interested to watch the kind of debates that take place, even in the House of Commons, between the ways in which they're going to have to deal with some very pressing issues. The issue around CFS comes quickly to mind of the AFN. The fact that there's been emergency situations in the north in Nunavut that are pressing, that are real dealt on the issue of infrastructure, and then of course all the different issues around resource development that are going to be pressing. To see two Indigenous peoples debate over these very significant issues that are really at the table, at the front steps of First Nations people in Mark Carney's vision for the country for the next few years. I'm going to be tuning in on House of Commons on Wednesday, which is when question period takes place. Only because it's interesting. I wonder if there's going to be a different diplomacy that's going to be there, or if it's the same old. As Jen pointed out, we are talking about the Canadian government that never fails to disappoint when it comes to the treatment of First Nations people. And it certainly is mired in some very conflictual and complicated and quite colonial trends when it comes to the treatment of these issues.
Well, Jennifer, the governing Liberals have announced that there's no federal budget coming, and as of now, only an economic statement coming in the fall. What do you think that could mean for Indigenous peoples?
I'm trying to be patient because I am on, I'll play the devil's advocate a little bit in that I am understanding that it will be incredibly difficult to get a budget together when Parliament hasn't been sitting. And these ministers have just been essentially given the widespread mandate from the Prime Minister this week. So to get a budget tabled and rushed through, in my opinion, wouldn't be that great because it would be very, very rushed. But at the same time, there are a lot of nations out there that are actively, working on big issues. And they're also looking for what the status is of renewed funding in certain areas. So I know, it's going to be another summer of waiting to see if there's various funding pools that will be renewed in the federal budget, especially as it pertains to public safety and stuff like that for community development. So it is a little bit frustrating because, we are on the back burner as First Nations people, and some of the things we're seeing on nations getting done when we're not entirely sure. And even the ministers, for nations that are doing active lobbying or GR with ministers, and some of those ministers aren't even going to be able to answer those questions until they know what the budget looks like.
Niigaan, as mentioned, there's already uncertainty around services like Jordan's Principle, the future of child welfare, among many other things. Do you think there will be an impact on those and others with no budget forthcoming?
Well, the promise was during the election campaign that the Jordan's Principle funding, the existing funding applications that are already in would be included. The ones that are already approved would be funded. So perhaps less so when it comes to worrying really about the pressing issue of Jordan's Principle. What happens a year from now, that's a completely different conversation. Okay, so let's just think about what's just happened in the past few days alone, this week. Mark Carney can have all the agenda that he wants. He can come up with ideas in housing, infrastructure, resource development, build, baby, build, which we've talked about many times in this panel. You have to reconcile before you can build, baby, build. And so he's going to need Maddie Galmasti, he's going to need Rebecca Chartrand, Buckley Belanger at the table right away to deal with these issues. But then Donald Trump comes out, goes to the Middle East, accepts a $1 billion plane or $100 billion plane, announces a missile Star Wars program, and then on top of that, then announces a massive bill, which I'm writing a column about it saying, never do I ever want to hear anyone talk about corruption of chiefs ever again. I think we're seeing corruption on a global scale when it comes to Donald Trump. And then Mark Carney has to respond to that. The problem is when you have an agenda, but you have a massive distractive force like Donald Trump, it means that you would then have to respond to missile jurisdiction, satellites in the sky, and now Mark Carney's attention is taken away from the issues of emergencies in the north, for example. So when you have this massive force, which then Mark Carney has to respond to, First Nations are most often left behind. That's why we need a budget. You have to have a budget to be able to solidify for ministers who are supposed to have autonomy. That's what Mark Carney promised, to be able to deliver the services necessary. The fact we're waiting to the fall is probably going to create a lot of emergency situations, which then the Liberals will have to double down on just to treat people like human beings.
Jennifer, lawyers for the federal government in a filing last week said consultation with the AFN and the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society over child welfare reform are basically going nowhere, and that approach should end. What do you make of that move?
I think we've heard a lot over the last year on this conversation, especially since the AFN Assembly back in October on child welfare reform. I'm starting to get a little bit frustrated, and I try not to pick too many sides in Indigenous politics, but I look at the Cindy Blackstock side, where Cindy has been advocating for this for so long, and that has been central to every argument she's had. Whether we can all sit here and say she's been 100% correct all of the time, I don't know, but I do know that children and our First Nations kids have been at the forefront of her advocacy since she started this. And with the AFN, it's very inherently political, and there has been issues with the AFN being accused of being too close to the Liberal government. The national chief has been involved in Liberal politics in the past. So understandably so, there are disagreements. And, Cindy Blackstock is going to be on the side of hearing from some chiefs that say, this isn't good enough. We need to communicate further. We need to consult. And then the AFN saying like, hey, let's just sign this deal. Let's get this over with. And I think the federal government is just in the middle of these two groups fighting and saying, you're on your own now, but where do we go from here? So I'm on the Cindy Blackstock side, and I'll be blunt about that, because at the end of the day, I don't think that any fight when it comes to our First Nations kids is one that we should let go easily of.
And Niigaan, that same filing has Lawyers for Canada placing the blame on the Caring Society for a deal not being reached, which of course is headed up by Cindy Blackstock, saying the Caring Society has been detrimental to discussions over child welfare reform. Blackstock says this is the same old song and dance from the feds trying to vilify her or chiefs rather than just provide the services. What's your take?
Well, I've been on the record several times in columns on this very panel, elsewhere, even on other TV programs, saying that the only one that can really save this deal is Cindy Blackstock. That's the only person who can be at the head of the negotiations. Now, I will say this. I will say fully at the awareness that I've been internal to several conversations during the negotiation for this deal. Cindy Blackstock can be tough to deal with, but it's because she holds the standard so high, as Jen pointed out just a minute ago. This is about kids' lives. This is not about compromise anymore. This is not about cutting corners or shaving off funds to be able to minimize the issues. I mean, the fact that they were minimized in the very first place has led to these emergency situations of children driven into the child welfare system. If you were to ask me who do I want at that table with the federal government, I want Cindy Blackstock. I don't want the AFN. We've spoken several times about the problems of the AFN taking administration funds. I think that if the AFN is in charge of this deal, and certainly it's evidence that they're just not going to get it done, what's going to happen is they're going to break into regions, they're going to break into factions, and then particularly those who are, and there are issues. I realize I just spoke just a minute ago about, I don't want to hear any more about corrupt chiefs. But there are certainly a lot of chiefs that see a lot of dollar bills in this deal, because there is a lot of opportunity for dealing with some of the key issues that First Nations are dealing with that really shouldn't come under this deal. Just like Jordan's principle, when you start to talk about kids, like where do you begin and where do you end? What do you fund? What do you not? When it comes to giving children the opportunity to not be driven into the child welfare system, that can be quite a slippery slope. And so what I would just say, but I can promise you that, if Cindy Blackstock was at the head of this deal, if the AFN said, hey, you brought us to this dance, which, let's be clear, it was Cindy Blackstock and Cindy Blackstock alone who then brought this deal forward. AFN was a partner in that, but it was Cindy Blackstock's advocacy that got us here. It really should be Cindy Blackstock that should be negotiating. And if the government lawyers have problems with that, well, that's a hard, too bad for you.
Speaking of the funding, Jennifer, the federal government says it has expensed $47.5 million on consultation already on child welfare reform. Nearly $27 million of that going to the AFN. Any thoughts on those numbers being made public?
It's a lot of money, and I think maybe I might be misspeaking here, but as somebody that works predominantly with First Nations and especially First Nations leadership, there seems to be this appetite or attitude, and it's been growing at an incredible rate of nations wanting to see more autonomy and grassroots advocacy outside of these organizations and these lobbying bodies. AFN, FSIN, all of them, they are not the rights holders. And they're acting as if they are, and they're advocating on behalf of us, but sometimes where they're missing the mark and it's getting too political. And honestly, I would rather see the day where we're starting to build our leadership up, we're building our communities up, we're getting back to that grassroots advocacy, because we're seeing all of this money flowing through the AFN and even these organizations. And it's frustrating because if you see the reality on the ground, number one, even for child welfare capacity building, the budgets aren't even that big. People think it's a lot of money, but it's not. Once you start putting together your capacity teams, trying to build the infrastructure, like there are pay lawyers to build your laws, the justice, all of it. There are so many moving pieces and the budgets are quite small, but you hear of these large amounts of money flowing through like the AFN and stuff like that. And it's really, really frustrating, because I feel like if the federal government got back to communicating one-on-one with our nations and our rights holders and respecting that advocacy and that autonomy, imagine where our nations would be. But we're creating too much bureaucracy, and we're even doing it amongst ourselves with these big groups. And I just don't think they speak for all of us anymore.
Niigaan, finally here, this filing came just days after the new Carney cabinet was sworn in, and for the first time ever, an Indigenous person at the helm of Indigenous Services. Cindy Blackstock questioned whether Minister Mandy Galmasti would even be aware of the filing, and said there's always been questions about who's directing Canada's lawyers. What do you make of the timing of this filing and the tone of the lawyers' argument?
The chess pieces are being placed on the board, is what I say. This is all about negotiation. When information is leaked to the media, talking about, for example, the administration fees that the AFN are administering, when lawyers are saying, well, the real problem of these negotiations is Cindy Blackstock. This is all about negotiation tactics. This is all about people who are trying to move chess pieces on the board to try to get the best deal for either for the government or for, in the case of Cindy Blackstock, children, in the case of the AFN, maybe communities and children, and at times the infrastructure on those, which are going to be essential for dealing with the issue. There is a whole bunch of tables, a whole bunch of political players that are within this. And this is exactly why what Jen pointed out just a minute ago, we've got some structures that certainly don't play towards the interest of rights holders, which are individual First Nations. And I think that, if a radical way of doing business or a radical solution needs radical approaches. And this is one of the problems, that we keep using the same old approach, using lobby groups, which are large political stake organizations, which do not have really any jurisdiction to talk about many of the things that they're already talking about, but being thrust into that, put into that position by the federal government, saying, okay, well, tell us what First Nations want. The problem is that the First Nations need to be speaking, and maybe in a different framework. I think one of the exciting things that's happening in Manitoba is Premier Wab Kinew turned to First Nations and said, tell me how you want to deal with us. We can't work effectively with 63 First Nations. It's going to be very slow. It's going to be very cumbersome. We're not going to get a lot done. So tell us how you want us to organize. And you know what had happened? Many of those First Nations started to organize culturally. The Anishinaabe nations got together. The Dakota nations got together, and they negotiated culturally, which is exactly traditional governance re-emerging. And I think that approach will be much more effective than these large-scale political lobby groups, which have people from coast to coast to coast who can't even really agree on anything very simple. This will be an approach I think the federal government needs to take. And yeah, it may be talking about regionality, but I think that's probably the way First Nations are going to operate in the future anyways, is whether the government sees the writing on the wall.
Jennifer, Niigaan, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks to you both.
You betcha.